Hello and welcome to the Capital Conversation with me, Michael Hayman. Now, my guest today is Sir Rod Aldridge, the business leader who built his own company and took it to the FTSE 100 in his own lifetime. He founded the outsourcing giant Capita in 1984, turning it into a multi-billion-pound firm, and is now a campaigner for improving the life chances of young people. Today, his passion is some 12 multi-academy schools and colleges across the country, all creating opportunities for a new generation. To tell us more, it's a great pleasure to welcome Sir Rod Aldridge to the Capital Conversation. Sir Rod, first of all, if I may say, you're better than they think you are, which is not the view of my audience, but is actually the title of your book.
It's the title of the book. I'm pleased to know that you recall it. I felt that it was important to really not only track my life, but to explain what it felt like coming from the background that I did, and how other young people now feel the same way as I do, but it was very therapeutic to write it.
But so explain that title. You're better than they think you are. What is that about? Self-confidence? Is that about belief?
Yeah, I think I've made a career out of being, very cautious about how people perceive me, to be sometimes not confident, and I had to develop those skills. And the book shows what that journey is like, and it's a way of encouraging others to believe that anything's possible if they set their mind to it.
Do you think there's enough belief in the UK? I mean, is it a country that has that kind of, I guess, that ambition, that self-belief?
I think that if you are of a certain sort, I think it's possible. But the problem, frankly, is that a lot of the people that come from the sort of communities I was a working class background, a phenomenal family unit. I was very lucky in that, but a very average education in failing my 11+. And when you come from that background, to actually make progress is not easy, because you haven't got the route map that others have. But
also, I mean, one of the things is that, reading the backstory is not accepting your lot, not accepting your place in terms of what people were saying you should be doing, but actually going further at each stage of your life's journey. I mean, that's the entrepreneur in you, I guess.
It's the entrepreneur, but it's also, I suppose, a trait of being very determined. I mean, I think I've said it before, I got angry. I just felt that wasn't right, and I was better than that, and I intended to prove to people that was the case. And I went about that in a very systematic, slow way, but when I found an opportunity, I went for it.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things, while we're talking about your early life, one of the things I was reading about was the difference between that kind of immediate post-war generation that were, much more accepting about how things worked, and I guess your generation, which were much more questioning, much more boundary pushing. And I mean, how did that affect you, do you think, in terms of the attitude that you've now got, that resilience?
There was no doubt about it that risk-taking was not one of the characteristics. You were very cautious. You knew your place. But fascinatingly, my mother and father, for example, owned their own house, which was an incredible thing in that day and age. So I almost had that upbringing where, prove something, you can do something, you're here to do something special.
But your dad had to restart his life age 50, which in that day and age was a very difficult thing to do.
It was very difficult, but an enormous credit to him.
So explain what happened.
Well, he was made redundant from a factory. He was a factory worker, and he'd been there for all of his life, and he was made redundant. And rather than signing on, as he would call it, he actually went about and started his own business.
And you said that reinforced my determination never to get in a position where an employer could treat me as badly.
I saw the way that he was dealt with and what the effect was on our family, and I feel great credit to what they did, but I felt that it wasn't right. But he was resilient and showed the sort of traits that I suppose I developed.
I mean, and about those traits, I mean, you've said that you can't create an entrepreneur, but you can create an entrepreneurial mindset. Well, what is the mindset, do you think?
Well, I think the fascinating thing is that what you do is you create somebody that doesn't want to accept the status quo, doesn't accept that because it was like that, it's going to be like it. So we now talk about having attributes such as team working, and one of the most phenomenal things about to work in a team, but equally to be a problem solver, not to stop if you've got something that you can't cope with, and then being creative and resilient, and all these things like being passionate and determined are really me. I mean, that's how I applied things.
Do you think that mindset is something we've all got? I mean, is it about releasing something inside, or is it something that you just really need to do the hard yards of learning?
I think, ironically, I think a lot of young people, very young children, have got a lot of this because their mind is very receptive and open.
So how young? What sort of
I
primary
think,
school?
Primary school, you
Right,
can definitely
okay.
see some of these traits and what we have seen. And then over time, the system, as I would call it, actually tries to corral them and restrict it. I resisted some of that, which is possibly why my education wasn't a good education for me. Maybe I was difficult, maybe I was, a kid that looked awkward in a class, but I rebelled against that.
Right, but does the system then set us up for failure? Is that your view?
My view that with some of the issues that we've now got with young people who come from very difficult communities, unless we change our approach to that, all you're going to do is to recycle the same problems. Certainly my feeling is that many more now will want to run their own businesses, for example.
And you created a foundation to address this. You're investing in 12 colleges and schools across the country. In terms of what you're seeing in terms of this issue about social mobility, when you look at the work of the foundation, I mean, give us a sense of the challenge that you're trying to address.
Well, I read something just before I come on, really, about the Social Mobility Commission, and it's quite interesting. Only 6% of doctors, 12% of journalists, and 12% of CEOs in the country come from a working class background. So the route map is not there, and there is a lack of confidence in believing that you can actually achieve. And what we have to do to change that is we have to change the approach. And that means that businesses, for example, they may well have social mobility targets, but they've got to go out and see and talk to young people to encourage them to apply for jobs. Otherwise, they just won't find their way to it.
I mean, you did something, extraordinary in the sense of building one of the country's biggest firms in your lifetime. In terms of that Capita experience on you, in terms of that journey from, I guess, a person working for someone, becoming an entrepreneur, and then running a major corporation. What were the learnings about that story, do you think, for you?
Well, I mean, this obviously now looks great because you read it,
Always
you
looks
write
good
it,
in the
it looks
rearview
fantastic,
mirror.
exactly. But I mean, what you've got to put into place here is that for 20 years I worked in the public sector. My first job at 16 was a postboy for a local authority, so I started at the bottom. And what I did, I learned. And I qualified as an accountant, and when I got an opportunity which came to me, I recognised that opportunity and I actually went for it. And I think a lot of people will always have that opportunity, but will they either do it or will they regret doing it and always talking about it? I did it, partly because, frankly, I was becoming quite desperate. I was 37, and I believed that there was something in me, and the opportunity came along.
But it sort of feels like that at every stage there was something, I guess, to react against. Like, you're working in the post room, you want to get a qualification, you become an accountant, you've got a job that people would say, great success story. You're sat there thinking, actually, I want to go and work in the private sector. You get that job, you then start to think about, I want to take it over and run my own business. You then run your own business, you want it to be one of the biggest companies in the country. What is that part of the attitude, if you will?
I think a lot of my opportunity came because, frankly, I'd applied for 15 jobs and not got one of them. So I wanted to improve my life. So exactly. So I thought, well, I'll start something. And I had the chance of starting something, and I had colleagues around me who wanted to do the same. And I think the trait with me is that once I see something and I go for it, I go for it. And I focus and I dedicate myself. And, bluntly, the 22-year story of Capita was an amazing story of starting from absolutely nothing and creating a new market. So my mindset is much more of thinking outside the box and new, as opposed to trying to, follow a path that others have done. And
we're heading to the break, but I mean, you get the sense that entrepreneurial phase, as opposed to being listed or indeed working for somebody else, but it feels like that entrepreneurial phase was where you as a person were most happy. I mean, is it true, and why?
I think it's something special working for yourself, and it's also something special in owning, some equity in it, and that switched me on. And you know, in 22 years, I never ever not wanted to go to work. I enjoyed every minute of it, and it was a great experience.
Brilliant. Well, that's the story of graft. I guess we're going to move on to the story of grit in terms of actually how you're overcoming some of those challenges when we come back. And when we do, we're going to look at those opportunities and indeed obstacles ahead, both for the future of work and the thoughts about what's next for the UK. Stay right with us. Welcome back. My guest today is Sir Rod Aldridge. Now, Sir Rod, we spoke earlier, I guess, about your career, but, you know, part of this is that you're an optimist, but also a realist. I mean, one of the things you've said is that what's going to come from the current climate is opportunity. Tell us a bit about the climate as you see it for the UK and indeed what the opportunity is from your perspective.
Well, quite clearly, we've gone through a very difficult period over the last 2 or 3 years with Brexit and what have you. And I also think with AI, that will create a completely different world.
So disrupted.
So anything that disrupts is an opportunity. In a way, outsourcing was an opportunity because people wanted to think about delivering services in a completely different way. And I think when you now look at technology and the technology platforms that you can create, which can change the relationship between your customer and the customer and the provider, this is a massive opportunity for somebody to really build a very sizable business.
Do you empathise with people's fears that, well, you know, what technology does is it drives jobs out of the economic world rather than sort of builds one? I mean, a lot of people are worried that actually, you know, the net effect of things like AI and robotics is that it will create more job losses than it actually delivers.
I think you've got to apply the learning and the knowledge and the education to things that won't be affected in that way. I mean, some of the emotional, technical end of things, maybe. But I feel there's enough space here to look at something and say, let them go for that, and we will focus on this, which is why I feel so strongly about the education and the fact that the education system is still primed to produce children that won't be able to cope with that, which is why I feel the entrepreneurial and enterprising side is so important, because that will stimulate a change and a benefit that will come from what we have.
I mean, but in terms of the change that education has got to therefore deliver, I mean, that feels like quite a big step change in terms of teacher attitudes, structural changes in schools. I mean, how big a kind of rewiring job are we talking about, do you think?
Well, I'm quite worried about it. I'll be honest with you. I feel the young people are probably thinking differently, but the system that is teaching them hasn't been educated and trained to respect some of those sort of opportunities.
I mean, I suppose the question then sort of that comes from that is I guess your views on whether this government gets that. I mean, you know, we're hearing lots of things about big infrastructure projects like trains and urban regeneration schemes, but if this is about the regeneration of people, in terms of actually how government opens the door to letting that happen, do you think anybody's listening to that debate, or is it just too difficult?
Well, it's obviously difficult, but you have a government now with a majority that can work these things, and you know, certainly in my world, in education, there are ways of doing this. I mean, we have an whole free school structure. Why not have free schools that teach young people in a different way? I mean, the opportunities are there, but my point is that the training that goes into the teaching side or the staff is not up to speed with that. So they can't recognise these traits, and they don't know how to encourage them. And
I mean, a big part of your network of schools and colleges, I mean, these are in tough places with tough stories and indeed big social challenges to overcome. Give us a sense of the on-the-ground experience in terms of what you're seeing from the Foundation's point of view.
Well, I decided I wanted to work in difficult communities, and by that I mean where education has historically been poor and life chances are similarly so. What we've experienced is that if you change some of the things, very basic things, well, not basic, but if you rebuild schools, which is what we've done, new schools.
Because they're all brand new, beautiful,
and most of them are brand new. You start with a different attitude, a different approach. You then have to transform the education. So I'm not saying education is not important, of course it is, but then we look at developing the all-round person, make them more employable, make them believe that things are possible, and give them the confidence to
So self-belief, confidence.
Correct.
Those are tangible things you can help people with, are they?
They're the tangible things that you can. Now, I think with some of their background, like the background of myself, I think that they will become highly employable, because when I look at the other side of it, I think employers are looking for people that are far more flexible, are hungry, are determined, passionate, all these things, and these characters will come at it.
Yeah, I mean, but it's funny, isn't it, that, you know, when you think about words like, you know, a disruptive influence in a classroom is like an entrepreneur's dream, a dreamer is a you know, somebody who's sort of like not succeeding in school. I mean, almost like the mismatch between the world of business and the world of education. It's all out there, isn't it?
It can almost go two ways, because that sort of character can go downward or further back, or can become enthusiastic and be developed.
So you've got to nurture that.
I think you've got to recognise it, and I think you then got to nurture. I mean, if you're brilliant academically, you're a phenomenal sportsman, people know what to do with you, or a musician. If you're an entrepreneur or have entrepreneurial tendencies, there is nothing in a school. So we've built in our schools pods where you can start businesses, for example. And it's been very difficult to get those introduced into a school, into the curriculum. I mean, Ofsted don't evaluate them. They don't think about what this is doing to the more social fabric.
I mean, I think it's an interesting point that you make, because, I mean, you're right, on sports, you know, because you're very much involved with that, with cricket. You've got a cricket academy where there are things that are well-trodden routes that you can do, like build an academy, sort of train people to take up an elite sport. But in terms of that business piece, that entrepreneurship piece, where so many bets of the future are being placed, nothing much physical in the same way.
Yeah, but it's interesting, although, I mean, you mentioned cricket and sport. I mean, it's fascinating, because actually in cricket, a lot of the attributes that we talked about, you have to apply, certainly leadership. And so we have found that the students that are going through this, their learning is accelerated because they're positive people about what they're doing. So they learn in the morning, and then they play high-level sport in the afternoon.
So, I mean, it's interesting, because a lot of people really do feel there are lessons to learn from sports for business and indeed life. I mean, that's something presumably you would support in terms of the skills people take from your sports work in terms of their daily life as much as entrepreneurship.
I mean, find what they're good at, find what they're interested in. Another thing we've done, we have a construction academy, so you can learn a trade. And there's nothing wrong with the trade, or, you know, you don't have to go to university. There are apprenticeships and other routes that you can follow. So what we tried to do is to be innovative, and I suppose that's me, in my thinking, because the system that is there wasn't working. So there's no point perpetuating it.
So as a change maker, as somebody that wants to go in and disrupt the system, cause a bit of trouble, I mean, how easy is that to actually do?
It's been more difficult than I thought. I have to say, I felt that if I can transform a service in outsourcing terms, I thought it'd be easy to transform a school. It's not been easy.
But isn't the story of your life, if it's not difficult, it's not worth doing? Could that not have been that could have been another book title? That could be the follow-up.
Yeah. So what I've actually done is to persevere with it. And to be fair to teachers, they've got a very tough job. And I think that they've been very receptive to change, and it will take time. But we are seeing outcomes from it. The performances have gone up, young kids have got jobs, phenomenal jobs, and communities have been regenerated as a way of what the asset of the school has done to the community itself.
I mean, and in terms of, I mean, your life as a philanthropist, as an activist, as somebody very much sort of embedded in the education system, in terms of the why do it? What do you personally get out of it? And perhaps a message to those that might be thinking about, well, what do they do with their lives in terms of actually what I can give back, the difference I can make? What's the urge? What's the sort of, what do you get out of it personally in terms of the message you'd give to others?
Well, I mean, I think I've obviously been very fortunate to build a company from a start-up to a FTSE. and that was an amazing experience.
So you want to give something back?
So I wanted to give something back. But what I've achieved in the last 13, 14 years in changing people's lives has been phenomenally more rewarding than being in a business sense. It's been different because I think the impact of wanting to give something back, but not only give money,
so
but
this
to
has
be
been
involved.
better than business for you in terms of the work you're doing with young children?
Because it's created new communities. It's created hope where, frankly, a lot of people didn't believe that they could do things. And it's interesting. I went.
So it's an emotional.
Yeah,
thing
it is.
as well.
But
Yeah.
one of the schools we've got is the very school that I went to as an 11-year-old when I failed my 11 plus, and I went back to that school when I was going to become its sponsor, 40 years on. And when I was shown round by a person, he said to me, "I don't know why you're coming here because these kids are not going to go anywhere. They're going to be hairdressers or bricklayers." And I thought that's what people said about me. And that is 40 years on, people are still saying that. And that is just not right.
So just to wrap up, because we're right out of time, but that's still the problem, but do you feel optimistic about we can solve it?
I feel very optimistic because young people want to solve it. That's the future.
Brilliant. Thanks very much for that, Sir Rod Aldridge. And it's all we have time for. And a big thanks to my guest, Sir Rod, the campaigner for a new generation of opportunities for the next generation of talent. His book, You're Better Than They Think You Are, is a message for life to not take no for an answer. And if you want to hear more success stories from Britain's top commercial campaigners, join me next time on The Capital Conversation. See you then.